Not a dramatic room, not the version from movies with a single hanging bulb and a metal table bolted to the floor. Just a room, small, neutral, walls that are slightly too bare to feel comfortable. A table, a few chairs, nothing particularly interesting about any of it. You're sitting in that room because you agreed to sit in it. Nobody forced you here. Nobody put you in handcuffs and walked you through a door. An officer asked if you had a few minutes to answer some questions, and you said yes, because you're innocent. And innocent people answer questions. Innocent people don't have anything to hide. Innocent people cooperate. And so here you are. The officer sits across from you. Their posture is relaxed, friendly even. They start with something completely ordinary. How long have you lived in the area? How well did you know the person involved? What were you doing that particular evening? Easy questions, the kind you'd answer anywhere without thinking about it. And for a few minutes, the whole thing feels almost manageable, almost normal. Then something shifts. You can't quite identify what it is. The questions are still polite. The tone hasn't changed noticeably. But somewhere in the last few exchanges, the conversation moved in a direction you didn't notice. And now you're explaining something, defending something that you never imagined you'd need to defend. The more you explain, the more you realize your explanation is not landing here the way it would land anywhere else. The more you talk, the more you feel like you're somehow making things worse. And a thought forms that you can't quite push away. How did I end up here? That question, that how, is what this video is actually about. Not just here are your rights in a list. Not a surface level traffic stop breakdown. Something deeper than that. Something that almost nobody talks about when these encounters get discussed online. This is about the psychology, the actual documented research mechanics of how questioning is structured, how it operates on the human mind, why it affects even people who are telling the absolute truth, and why, once you genuinely understand it, the whole picture looks completely different. Before anything else, I want to say something clearly and mean it. This is not an anti-police video. The psychological techniques we're going to discuss are documented in academic literature, studied by researchers, discussed openly in legal training environments. Understanding them doesn't make you adversarial, it makes you informed. Doctors understand how diseases work. That doesn't make them afraid of their own bodies. It just means they're not caught off guard when something happens. That's all this is. Let me start with a concept called the illusion of control. It's a well-established psychological phenomenon. It describes our tendency to believe we have more influence over a situation than we actually do. And it shows up powerfully in questioning contexts for one very specific reason. When you walk into a room voluntarily, when you choose to answer questions, when you present yourself as a cooperative participant, your brain registers that as being in control of the situation. You decided to come. You're choosing to answer. You could leave if you wanted, right? That feeling of control actually makes you less careful, not more. Because the psychological guard that activates when you feel threatened or cornered never triggers when you feel like you're managing things yourself. Innocent people are particularly susceptible to this because they genuinely are open. They're not managing a lie. They don't need to be careful about contradictions. They have no reason to guard themselves, so they don't. And that genuine, authentic, nothing to hide openness can become the most complicated thing in that room. Here's something that surprises people when they first learn it. Researchers who study false confessions, and this is peer-reviewed academic research, not speculation, have documented that innocent people have confessed to serious crimes they did not commit. Not as rare edge cases, often enough that it's a recognized, named, studied phenomenon with an extensive body of literature behind it. How does that happen to people who are telling the truth? It doesn't happen because they're stupid. It doesn't happen because they're unusually weak. It happens because the human mind under sustained psychological pressure does things that the human mind under normal conditions would never do. It rationalizes. It searches for exits. It starts treating the other person's certainty as a form of evidence against its own memory. And it can happen to anyone. That's the genuinely uncomfortable part. The people who are most certain it could never happen to them are often the ones who are most vulnerable, because that certainty is itself part of the illusion of control. Let's get into the actual mechanics, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Questioning techniques used in formal investigative settings are not improvised. They're not just an officer running on instinct. Many of them are part of documented frameworks. The most widely known is called the Reed technique, that have been studied, taught, debated, and used in various forms for decades. The Reed technique is a multi-step method based on a specific theory, that behavioral indicators can suggest deception, and that applying psychological pressure around those indicators will eventually produce either a truthful denial or an admission. Now, and this is an important nuance, researchers and legal scholars have raised legitimate questions about the accuracy of this method, particularly its ability to reliably distinguish truthful people from deceptive ones. That debate is real and ongoing. But what's not debated is that structured questioning works at producing statements, including, in documented cases, from innocent people. The question is, why? And the answer to that is what actually helps you. The first element is called minimization. It's exactly what it sounds like. The process of making the situation seem smaller, more human, more understandable. Look, I get how these things happen. People make mistakes. This doesn't have to be a big deal. The implicit message, just tell me and I'll understand. We can keep this manageable. The psychological mechanism is guilt reduction. If you've done something wrong, minimization offers a path that feels lower stakes. If you haven't done anything wrong, and this is the subtle part, minimization still creates a kind of pressure because the framing implies there is something to minimize, and your mind starts searching for what it might be. The second element is maximization, the opposite lever, often used alongside minimization, deployed when minimization hasn't produced movement. Maximization emphasizes the seriousness of the situation. The evidence is substantial. Things will get significantly worse without cooperation right now. Addressing this early is in your direct interest. The psychological mechanism is fear, specifically the kind of compressed, urgent fear that produces desperate thinking. When we believe a situation is critical and accelerating, we look for any path that reduces the immediate pressure, even if that path has costs we're not fully calculating. Minimization and maximization together create a psychological vice. One side says, cooperating makes this small. The other side says, not cooperating makes this catastrophic. In the middle of that, people talk. Now here's the element most people don't recognize as part of the structure, the rapport phase. Before any pressure, before anything that feels like an interrogation, there is almost always a period that feels like nothing. Just a conversation, getting comfortable, finding some common ground, being warm. This is not simply professional courtesy. It serves a specific psychological function. Because rapport does something concrete to the human brain, it creates a reciprocity impulse. When someone has been warm with us, when they've seemed to understand us, when they've appeared to be on our side, we want to maintain that. We want to stay in their good standing. We're motivated to keep the positive relationship going. And that motivation, that very human, very understandable desire to maintain warmth with someone who's been warm to you, is one of the most powerful engines behind voluntary disclosure. You're not telling them things because you calculated it was in your interest. You're telling them things because they were genuinely decent to you, and it feels wrong to shut that down. This works on almost everyone, not because something is broken in us, because something is deeply functional. Our social instincts, our reciprocity, our wiring for human connection. Good things that, in this specific context, get engaged in ways that don't serve us. Here's the section I want to be most careful with, because it's important, it's real, and it's also easy to misread. In certain jurisdictions and certain investigative contexts, officers may be legally permitted to make inaccurate statements during questioning. The extent of what's permissible varies significantly by jurisdiction, by agency policy, and by the specific circumstances of an investigation. This is not a universal practice, and policies and legal limits around questioning techniques differ considerably depending on where you are. But the documented practice of presenting false information, saying evidence exists that doesn't, implying a witness said something they didn't, has been studied by researchers specifically because of its psychological effects. What false information does in a questioning context is trigger something called memory reconsolidation. When you're told confidently that a specific thing happened, even if it didn't, your brain doesn't simply reject that. It searches. It questions what it knows. It introduces uncertainty into memories that were previously clear. This is not a flaw in particularly gullible people. It's a feature of how human memory actually works. Our memories are not recordings. They're reconstructions. And subsequent information, including false information, can influence how those reconstructions form. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades documenting this through rigorous research. Her work on how external information shapes memory recall is foundational to modern understanding of eyewitness testimony. This is why the advice to wait for legal counsel before answering questions isn't just about legal strategy in a narrow sense. It's about protecting your own memory from a process that can alter it in ways that feel completely genuine. Not because every officer is running these techniques, not because every questioning situation involves these dynamics, but because you cannot always know in the moment which situation you're in, and the protection is the same regardless. Now let's talk about what you actually do with all of this, because information without application is just a different kind of anxiety. Here is the single most important practical thing to understand. Every psychological mechanism we described requires your active participation to function. Minimization works because you engage with the narrative. Maximization works because you respond to the pressure. Rapport works because you reciprocate the warmth. The false information technique works because you search your memory in response to the claim. Every one of these mechanisms needs the other half of the conversation, which means the most protective thing you can do is make a calm, clear, deliberate choice about what you participate in. Not aggressively, not hostilely, not in a way that creates conflict or escalates anything. Just a clear choice, made from a place of information rather than instinct. That choice has a phrase. "I'd like to speak with an attorney before answering any questions," said once, calmly, clearly. Here's what that sentence actually does. First, it does not make you look guilty. Research on how this is interpreted in legal contexts consistently shows that invoking the right to counsel is understood as an exercise of a known, established right. It's not an anomaly. It's something informed people do. Second, it creates a circuit breaker in the psychological process. It stops the rapport phase from building toward disclosure. It stops the minimization and maximization cycle before it has time to establish its grip. It removes your memory from the process that can inadvertently alter it. None of those techniques can operate if you're not engaged in the conversation. "I'd like to speak with an attorney before answering any questions." Say it once. Mean it. Stop talking. I know the first objection. I know it because it's the one everyone has. But doesn't asking for a lawyer make me look guilty? Let me address this directly because it deserves a direct answer. In formal legal proceedings, in front of a jury, in a courtroom, invoking your right to counsel cannot be used as evidence of guilt. That's foundational. It's constitutionally protected. In the practical social moment, in that room, in that conversation, invoking your rights may change the energy. The officer may seem less warm. The rapport that was building may cool. And your brain will register that shift and produce real discomfort. That discomfort is the rapport mechanism. That's it doing exactly what it's designed to do, creating a social cost for choosing The psychological framework we described requires your participation to function. Every technique needs the other half of the conversation. And the most protective thing, the simplest, clearest, most effective thing, is to disengage from that participation early. Not rudely, not with hostility, with calm clarity. I'd like to speak with an attorney before answering any questions. That one sentence, meant, followed, not qualified with a bunch of explanation afterward, does more to protect you in a formal questioning context than almost anything else. And it does it in a way that is completely lawful, completely calm, and completely consistent with behaving like a reasonable, cooperative person who simply understands their rights. Because that is what this information is for. Not to make you combative, not to make you afraid, not to make you assume bad faith in every interaction, to make you someone who moves through these situations with clarity instead of confusion. Who doesn't get to the end of a conversation wondering what just happened? Who responds thoughtfully instead of reacting automatically? That's the person you are after watching this. Now, between this video and the next one, I want you to sit with something. We talked today about formal questioning, the rooms, the documented techniques, the psychological mechanics. But there's a related situation that most people find even harder to navigate. And it's harder precisely because it doesn't look like what we described today. It looks like a neighbor talking to an officer on their front lawn, a coworker being asked routine follow-up questions, a family member who got a call that seemed completely routine at first. Third-party questioning, people who are adjacent to a situation, not suspects, not formally involved, being asked questions that feel friendly and informational and low stakes. Those conversations often produce the most significant disclosures because the psychological guard that someone might have for themselves completely disappears when they think they're just helping someone else out. The psychology behind that situation, how it works, why it works on people with genuinely good intentions, and what actually protects everyone involved is what we're going into next. And honestly, it's the one that I think surprises people the most.